friend, Rick Pastor.
Thank you, Peter. I'm still getting here. Still says Peter Carlson is presenting. Oh, I've got it. Resume. Here we go.
There you go. I swear, guys, we actually practiced this. It works.
Do you have my agenda?
Yes, we do.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you, Peter. It's great to be working with you in a more collaborative partnership. As you mentioned, the key issue study that Hackett does every year, we open that up to your mid-market constituents, and they responded with actually about a third of the responses have come from your organization. And we appreciate you taking the time to do that. The survey's open this week and closes basically at the end of this week. And what I've done is pull a lot of the data out of that to get an early look at what we've found here. And Chris and I will talk about that. Key things that we're going to touch on are the expectations for 2021 that shaped the leadership of IT. What's on IT's agenda overall, on average. We'll zero in on some staffing issues and skills, and touch on some operating model evolutions that we're seeing. And ultimately, what is IT's performance going to be based on? What's it going to be evaluated on next year after, a weird year this year? I want to introduce our two panelists that are going to be working with us to get the practitioner perspective. I've been working with CIOs since I was 24. And these two gentlemen I have had the pleasure of collaborating with for going back a couple of decades, actually. Brian Shield is the VP of IT for the Boston Red Sox organization, a massively disrupted industry, as you know, from what happened this year. He's been a CIO, though, for 18 years, and previously was the IT leader at the Weather Channel. And also spent some time at FTD, all companies everyone's heard of, Brian. And then going all the way back to Wang Laboratories in Boston, which hopefully you remember that brand. It was an innovative company that did some amazing things on the desktop. So thank you for joining us, Brian.
Happy to be here.
And the second CIO we are going to be tapping into here for explanations and experiences is Gregory Smith. He's the CIO of the American Kidney Fund. He's also a professor at the graduate school at Georgetown University. He's been CIO at Pew Charitable Trust, and where I met him, he was CIO at World Wildlife Fund for about a decade, from 2001 to 2010. And we've had some interesting discussions, but nothing like what happened this year. And I just want to say one thing. You've been thanked a lot as CIOs. You were thanked a lot by your constituents for what happened and how you made sure the company kept operating and you made sure people were able to do their work. And maybe this is the last time this year, but I'm going to express my thank you for what you were able to do for business this year. And now we're moving on to what comes next. First of all, we have to return to business stability, correct? So what our data is showing us is that most people expect that to happen in the second half of 2021. And this has actually been a moving target. It started more people in the first half of 2021, and now it's kind of degenerating to later in the year. But I certainly would like to hear, Brian, how this looks for the Red Sox for stability, and then back to normal if we can get back to normal.
Yeah, no, thanks, Rick. Yeah, I'd almost have to separate sort of back to normal from stable a little bit, in part because I think, as everyone's keenly aware, the in the field of sports and entertainment, it's going to be a bit of a crawl, walk, run, in terms of how we get back to, I'll call it, true normal. I think, though, from a technology perspective, however, we are seeing COVID as sort of a dramatic accelerant of our digital strategy, and whether it's cashless. It's funny, for those, I know a number of folks work in the Northeast, but those that may have been to Fenway before, or really any kind of ballpark, it's the days where you can imagine sort of, passing your cash down 20 people to your left to get your hot dog passed back to you seem like those days are gone. So, in order to kind of, move to a more cashless digital, environment, we're making a tremendous number of changes. And I think most of those will all be in place in preparation for opening day next year. So I think from a business standpoint, I feel like we're dramatically accelerating. I think, and I share this with Rick, but I view 2021 for us as really being sort of the great experimental year. When we have sort of reduced fans, we know it's going to be, as I said before, it's going to take a little while to get back to normal. And it gives us an opportunity to sort of, I think 2021 is like test out a few things to see kind of what works for fans as we sort of, evolve to the new normal, if you will.
I like that classification of 2021 as a year of experimentation. You might think of it as a year of transition, but you don't really know what you're transitioning to. So it's not that clear cut. It's more, like you said, an experimentation year. Gregory Smith at American Kidney Fund, how's your stability curve looking and your back to normal curve looking?
I've got to be honest, we're probably one of the luckier organizations that I've chatted with as a CIO, because I collaborate with many. We transitioned almost seamlessly into a near 100% remote work environment. I joined 3.5 years ago as the CIO and put a completely different strategy in place for hybrid cloud, real-time data integration through web services for our cloud products. And one of the things that we did was we moved our grant processing capability into a cloud environment, and we outsourced all our payment services to have redundancy across both checks, ACH, and debit cards. So we're pushing hundreds of millions of dollars out the door annually to patients across the country, and we haven't skipped a beat since we moved into the new normal environment. I would actually say that, I thought about this over the weekend because we did chat earlier on this. I think we actually hit stability at American Kidney Fund at the end of the second quarter or at the very beginning of the third quarter of 2020. We are probably as productive, if not more productive as an organization now virtually. We were prepared for this. We planned for something different. I'll be honest on that. I wasn't planning for a pandemic, but it turns out what we planned for worked in a pandemic. And
you mean in terms of disaster recovery planning?
Absolutely. We were very aggressively pushed disaster recovery. We tested it with our staff, and we made sure that it was scalable to 100%, not to a smaller percentage. And I think a lot of firms kind of ran into trouble because they didn't have the technology or couldn't procure the hardware to move things out the door fast enough to get it to their staff. We had that already nailed down. So even our funding has stayed consistent. We just approved our budgets for 2021, and they did not drop. So we as an organization have actually fared through this crisis fairly well. We're focused predominantly on our patients and the ability to execute to support our patients, both financially and from an educational standpoint. And we're able to do that today. And we fully anticipate being able to do that until there is a vaccine and we get the green light to go back to, whatever the post-COVID environment's going to be. I'm sure it's going to be slightly different, but we're not there yet.
Thank you. That's a great example of how IT really kind of built the bridge over the chasm and helped the employees get across that as quickly as possible. And disaster recovery, whatever you want to call it, it's part of the job, right? But it's also pretty heroic in my opinion.
It's that 1% insurance policy, and if you need it, boy, does it come in handy. If you don't test it to the full scale that you need, you get really burned by the results if you're not prepared.
Now we have many of you told us what you expect to be part of the new normal. What kind of characteristics of this COVID environment are going to be enduring, are going to continue on? Maybe not indefinitely, but at least in a significant way. We have three categories where these percentages of our respondents to Key Issue Study told us they expect these conditions to continue and be part of the new normal fabric of doing business. So in the area of digital, you have an acceleration of technology innovation. You also have an accelerated rate of disruption coming at your industry. And certainly a major shift to digital delivery channels and goods and services, as Brian mentioned, going to digital ticketing and probably food ordering as well, because that's a huge part of the event. And just really, it's a faster march to the transformation that digital has been on everyone's agenda all along. Market conditions, slower economic growth is predicted by almost half of you. One of the good things to come out of this is you get a new talent pool, potentially global talent pool that you can tap into, as long as your company kind of had an epiphany that it's okay for people not to work in the corporate office. That's not true everywhere, but we'll get into some data on that too. And then in social and political arena, 65% of people say, there's going to be a very structural change to supply chains because of trade issues and economic relations on the global stage. We also will continue to have concern about public health. Remember, that's what started this whole thing. And a lot of people expect more social and political instability. COVID isn't the only problem out there. It's just brought a spotlight onto other things. So that's what we're sort of seeing in shaping the leadership of IT and the business going forward. I want to couple that with another data point from our study, which is about the risks, current top risks. This is not from IT leaders, by the way. This is across all of the G&A leaders, this particular data point, what the risks of the business look like. So cybersecurity is always number one. There's a very serious fear of a financial crisis that we're in. It's affecting some more than others. The prolonged pandemic, political and social instability as well. Now, we also asked, what do you think is going to increase the most in risk, and your concern for that risk over the next 2 years? And here you see, well, take a look. You see that political instability jumps way up to number 2. People think that that's going to be a more dangerous issue before it goes away for their businesses. And of course, cybersecurity stays up there all the time. Chris, do you have any thoughts about this risk environment?
Yeah, I think as IT leaders, we all just need to be present and aware of the ramifications of these things, right? And I think depending on the culture of your organization, some perhaps are a bit more progressive when it comes to the political or the societal instability, where others, this is going to be something more where they're going to have a more intended focus behind it. It's certainly not something we can ignore. So I think more than anything, it's just an awareness and an understanding of the context of what that means within your organization. As far as cyber, that's been number one for years. It's always a growing concern, and we hear more and more every day about different breaches, how it's affecting us personally, if we've had our own information compromised, that sort of thing. So I don't really see that going away. It's been there for the past, I want to say 3-4 years, Rick, as number one. But some of these other areas, I mean, they're obviously outside of the political and societal piece, pandemic, the availability of labor, what's driving our competition, and we need to think about that from our go-to-market strategy, and we'll talk more about technologies in a minute. But all of these things are really just awareness at this point, and you really have to kind of digest it internally as to what it means for your organization, culturally speaking.
Just a quick thing, is my screen showing clearly here, or do I need to make any changes?
It is. Yes, it is. I was just going to answer that question. Just if anybody's having trouble seeing Rick's slides, go to the 3 dots in the lower right-hand corner, choose change layout, and usually auto will do it for you, or sidebar. One or the other will probably work best for you. So
okay.
Sorry to interrupt, Rick.
All right, Chris, here's the projections for 2021 and last year, what actually happened to IT. Why don't you explain this one?
I think this probably comes as no surprise to most folks here. We're going to continue to see an increasing workload. And And we did ask in the current study what actually happened thus far in 2020, and what's your prediction for 2021. And so workload volume increasing at kind of a steady rate year over year. We're seeing just south of an 8% increase in workload. Yet we're only getting a little bit of relief from a budget perspective, from an overall spend on the IT function, and maybe a slightly higher bump than we would predict in the number of FTEs we have to support our initiatives in 2021. But you can see realistically in 2020, we took a hit when it comes to having resource availability. So we'll talk in a little bit about resource constraints and overcommitment and how that continues to be a hurdle for us. And it's clearly demonstrated here, right? Our workload continues to outpace the budget increases or the staffing increases that we're predicting to have in 2021. And I'd be curious if there's any questions or comments from our CIOs here, or from anybody in the audience, if there's related to these expectations, anything that perhaps you didn't see that you expected to see, or something else that resonated with you.
Yeah, I would just add, Rick, if you bring that last slide up for just a second, I think your data points are tend to be accurate, at least as for myself, and as I think as we talk to some of our peers and colleagues. The one thing I would say is, I think, and maybe it'll come up in further conversation, is I think the volume's increasing, but I think the nature of the portfolio is shifting a little bit. So the type of work that we're working on next year is different a little bit in some respects in terms of what we're working on this year. We talked about digital accelerants and those sort of things, but I think there's some learnings, I think, from the first call it 7 or 8, 9 months of time in 2020 that I think we'll get that they haven't already been addressed within the end of this year. They'll certainly get addressed next year. So I think there's it's a changing dynamic, but I think the overall values seem accurate.
I agree with Brian on that. In fact, I think that the demand is there. The prioritization has shifted, but the demand is there, and it's pre-COVID demand, the demand during COVID, and I anticipate demand post-COVID will continue to outpace the supply of what IT really can deliver. So I still see demands that are going to be higher than what budgets were typically going to allow and approve for the organization. I see that happening consistently, whether it's pre-COVID, during COVID, or post-COVID.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look at what IT priorities and initiatives are shaping up to be for 2021. So this, again, is from dozens of CIOs that we surveyed, including many mid-market CIOs. So what they're telling us their priorities are for the coming year: keeping things secure, number one. Being more of a strategic partner to the business. That's always a goal, but it's more critical now than ever. Aligning IT skills with where the business is going, and closing those skill gaps, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Being more customer-centric and innovative in your culture of IT, and accelerating IT's own digital transformation, which has kind of been left off the table for too long. In fact, I just want to mention that another one of our data points is telling us that 36% of IT leaders said they really have not started transforming IT as a digital function, and 44% have been at it only 1 to 2 years. So this really needs to kick into high gear, and I think that's what we're seeing here. Then the major initiatives on the agenda, these are confirmed major initiatives for 2021. Revising workflows to reduce manual dependencies. That is almost off the chart as a number one, and I'm sure that's completely COVID related. You also see an ability to get data to be more usable, more valuable, and moving to some of a increased work from home staffing model for IT. I want to point out rationalized project demand, better governance, better vetting. That gets at what our panelists were just saying, which is we have more workload, but it's different. And what you're prioritizing and what you're working on is going to be vetted differently. So I'd love to hear some thoughts about these kinds of initiatives and how they're playing out in your organizations. Gregory, if you want to start.
Sure. Well, we kind of flipped some prioritizations on our business intelligence. We've been heavy into BI. It's been a multi-year initiative to use data and to make better decisions across the organizations. And we've kind of flipped prioritization from our grants application into our consolidated CRM and screening side. So we're gonna reprioritize based on the initiatives that are happening in the organization. We're also going to be making some changes in 2021 to our grants application that haven't been made in decades from an eligibility standpoint. So that's going to be a focus, and it's a different focus that we hadn't anticipated previous to COVID. So we have just had that shift and change, but we are planning on bringing the BI full 360-degree constituent view back into play in 2021 to continue to leverage best of breed business intelligence systems and to have the best data for our decision making that we can have.
Was there a motivation for that in this crisis particularly?
It was interesting. I think we've been in conversations for years about changing some of the eligibility rules, and I don't want to get ahead of it too far because it's something we haven't publicly, announced as to what they're going to be. But it just turned out that during COVID is when we came to the decision that we were going to do this, and that's what changed some of the other prioritization because. We have to be very cognizant working in a virtual environment not to oversubscribe our resources. And you can easily do that. In the office, it's easy to do because you tend to have more physical meetings, but virtually the meetings, they change and they just happen differently. We just have to be cognizant not to oversubscribe the staff because overwhelming our staff with too many initiatives is not going to get the results we're looking for. It's not going to get us the accuracy, the integrity of the data, and the final solutions that we put in place. And we've really, taken COVID as a year to relook our prioritizations, but the demand is strong, as we've talked about before. It's just a slight shift. If I had to guess what percentage of our IT strategy is shifting, I would say probably only 20% of it. The remaining 80% is what we had on the docket from our strategic plan, and we're executing against that as planned.
Got it. Brian, you the number one major initiative is also one of your top initiatives at the Red Sox, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think of when I think of revise and automate workflows and reducing manual things. I mean, I think COVID, if nothing else, has been sort of a wake up call for a couple of things. One, it's really driving employee productivity. I think employee productivity historically isn't sexy and isn't viewed as being strategic oftentimes. And as a result of it, it sort of gets second fiddles to a lot of other things when you're, doing priorities. In times of crisis, though, where people are asked to do more with less, employee productivity, it's hard to just turn on a dime, right? Because those things are, it usually requires a fair amount of analysis to kind of do it right. But I do think that's going to be a big one. I think closely related to that one and is really kind of having sort of a decommissioning strategy of your legacy. I mean, I think if nothing else from this COVID period was that, I'm sure we all ran into some of our systems. We all have sort of retirement plans for a lot of our technology, but I think, again, it's been given a little bit of a kick in the butt and, a realization that, these things are more strategic than we give them credit for. So I think there's a little bit of, debt to be paid, for companies to sort of level set before they can start to really heavily focus on the digital if they haven't gotten there yet. The challenge with digital, and I think you're right, Rick, about sort of, some percentage of people feeling as if they haven't embarked on that effort. And part of it goes back to the word digital and that it's confusing to people, right? I mean, what defines a digital strategy? And I think, but when I look at this list here, especially I think a lot of them, our ability to leverage data, I think, better decision-making, more timely decision-making in my mind is maybe, as important as anything going forward. Certainly it is for us, in collaboration with how do you better service your customers and things like that. So I think it's a great list, and I think it would do well for CIOs, I think, to kind of align sort of their plans around many of these different items.
Since you mentioned decommissioning systems and retiring technology, the last one on the list is reduce technology complexity. People who from the mid-market who completed the key issue study should have received a Hackett report on the strategy of reckoning with complexity and ways of getting rid of complexity that's getting in the way of agility and speed. So, and also we're going to provide after this conference a tool you can use online to kind of assess your complexity reduction opportunity and where it's stronger. So we'll be continuing to talk about this, Brian, as we go. Chris.
Yeah, so what we'll look at here is the common increases in digital tool adoption. So to the previous point, what does it mean to be digital? And it's funny because when you talk to technology leaders, we've been digital for a long time. That's what we do. We're in the technology function, right? So, how do you put a box around it and better define that? And so when we think about tools, what does this mean? And you've both brought up advanced analytics and modeling, and that was number one the past 2 years running. This year, cloud has recaptured the top two spots. So moving to an overall cloud-centric kind of platform basis, and then moving as much as we can to as a service within our applications. So I'd be curious, and Gregory, maybe we can start with you. You had talked about some of the things that you did in moving to the cloud over the past couple of years that helped with your resiliency through this, particularly your phone system, I think it was.
Yeah, boy, I tell you, we have call centers, multiple call centers and staff in our organization, 800 numbers that roll to menus to various different departments. And, we need to be able to support our patients and the constituents in the organization that we do support across the United States. And we moved our cloud, our phone system, our PBX into the cloud in actually 2019. We did it prior to 2020. This was part of our 3-year strategy to really simplify and move a lot of our ERP applications in the clouds, and then stitch the data together with real-time integration with web services. So we got that out of the way. When we went into a COVID environment, and literally I sat down with my chief operating officer 30 days before we actually left the building and said, we need to start planning for this. We seamlessly cut over. We had already had multiple scenarios where we had tested having people working from home. They're basically logged into a Mitel cloud environment, which is the old, I guess it's the ShoreTel brand, which Mitel acquired. And our agents are able to work pretty much anywhere in the world that I don't block them coming into the portal, which we have a pretty secure portal, and we have very, very strict security around that, both geo IP level blocking and country level blocking. But as long as they're in, places that are friendly nations, they can pretty much work anywhere in the world and support our constituents. So our phone system was an absolute critical part of moving into the cloud. It's interesting. I look at this and I think that I view this in the order that it's there because a lot of organizations still haven't made this shift appropriately. We're actually the opposite. We've got business intelligence, advanced analytics and modeling, and workflow tools at the top. We've already done the cloud platforms and the application suites. We're there. We're done that. We've deployed our last major ERP application January of 2020, literally just about 2.5 months before this whole thing came wrecking down on the economy. And quite frankly, we got lucky from a timing perspective because it was a human capital management system, including our payroll operations. And I would not have wanted to have that be an on-prem application during this environment.
It's interesting. We've talked to a lot of technology leaders, and some of them are I don't want to say lucky enough, but perhaps preparing for something different, but is what we've been coining unexpectedly prepared, right? We did a lot of things to move our organizations forward and transform digitally, and reaping the benefits through having better agility and resiliency during this pandemic. Brian, I know you guys have made some pretty aggressive moves to cloud as well, and we talked and some of the prep around what you're doing around the fans and their information, kind of coupling that with the analytics for their actual experience. Maybe you can say a few words about how you guys are leveraging cloud and the analytics pieces and maybe some machine learning and some other advanced technologies as well.
Sure. Yeah, so picking up on what Greg had said, I think this is in the right order also, interestingly enough. We were very fortuitous that we embarked on an effort starting in January this year to move all of our major, at least business-facing data to GCP, Google GCP, and we finished that up around mid-July. And it's been a lifesaver for us. And so we now have a very good understanding, single view of the fan type of mind model, if you will. Simultaneously, we kind of moved everything into Salesforce. We were kind of a bit of a hybrid before that and things. So in our focus, again, really probably covers these first four in some respects, which was all around sort of making data more accessible, more visible, leveraging machine learning. We're doing a lot of things kind of behind the scenes, both mostly in this particular case, on the focus on the business, but certainly in the area of baseball and analytics as well. And then, and continue to sort of look for ways that we can sort of better serve customers. I think fundamentally that everything that we do is kind of very that approach for us. So I think kind of like Greg, we're either really smart or really fortunate that we some of these efforts in advance. For those that haven't, though, because not everyone was, fortunate enough to, have maybe been able to kind of reset their budgets and, their objectives. I think it's a great slide to kind of go back to your CFO with and say, listen, whether it's on our back office issues or other things, we need to kind of accelerate. These things are lifesavers kind of going forward, and everyone needs access to fast information, better decision making, and resilient systems. And I think that's almost a starting point. It's really kind of stake on the table here a little bit in terms of what everybody kind of needs in order to be successful.
I kind of feel for the organizations, and I know there are many out there that have not been as prepared as the Red Sox organization and the American Kidney Fund. And it's typically a budget funding issue. It's not as often a strategy issue. The strategy could be there and could be right, but it's a funding issue. And I'll tell you, the organizations that have not spent the appropriate dollars on their technology planning, today those budgets are going to increase, and the value of the CIO role is going to also increase across the globe.
You would think so. Just one quick follow-up question on the use of analytics. People are wrestling with making the data more accessible and useful and valuable. We saw that on a previous slide as one of the top priorities. So Brian, how did you get the data that you wanted in a usable form for machine learning and so on?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and a lot of it comes down to a ton of hard work, right? So and by no means do I feel as if on the machine learning side have we cracked the code here, but another word that hasn't been used yet, but it's one of those words that probably doesn't get enough value is kind of around data governance. I mean, the reality is it's, I remember seeing the statistic probably like 3 years ago, and someone was asking about data scientists about the nature of their job, and I think 75% of them said they were more like data janitors. And I think that was incredibly well said, because I think companies in their evolution towards data, they go through this cycle of collecting it, but collecting it is the first step, but then you kind of rationalize the fact that, oh my gosh, this data is really in a bad state. It's apples and coconuts, and trying to drive business decisions from it is challenging. So we've had an effort to kind of clean up our data now for at least the last 3 years, and we've made good progress that allows us to make informed decisions. We're not there yet, and you're never done. This is one of those cleaning up the basement type of things. It tends to come back to you on a regular basis. But I feel like companies that, again, haven't had the opportunity to kind of embark on sort of their full data strategy, or maybe a cloud-based data strategy, it does need to almost be part and parcel with sort of a data governance model, at least at the highest level. And I'm not a big fan of the word, but what they call it, data simplification, data integrity. There's got to be something that kind of drives the company to adapt its culture to deliver, best-in-class data, so you can make informed decisions.
I agree with Brian 100%. And in fact, I'd add to that and say that organizations have also got, that's part of their data governance strategy, they've got to start thinking about the length of the data and the duration of the data that they're keeping, and really start to look at how much data do I need, and when can I purge and archive it? The simple rule of data is that 90% of data is unused after 90 days. And that holds true for data analytics and data scientists, unless you're looking at trend data across quarter by quarter or year by year. And you just have to know how much detailed data to keep. versus how much visualization data or trend-based data or maybe KPI-based data is really going to be helpful to the organization. But the underlying granular data, keeping decades of that stuff, is absolutely not a helpful activity for an organization from a governance standpoint.
Yeah, and I think on to Greg's point, layer on top of that, like, CCPA and, data privacy growth and things. And, we know we'll have our version of GDPR here in the state before too long. It's almost your hands being forced really to both limit the data that you're maintaining, especially on customers, but also to do it sort of thoughtfully, so if you didn't have a good reason perhaps in the past to sort of, make this a priority, you kind of got a bunch of them right now, I think.
Yeah, I think those are all critical issues, and it would be good if there was a term better than data governance. Maybe we should have a contest. I think data valuation or something that indicates that what you're doing is making data more valuable and for the business, maybe then people would be willing to invest some time in it. And Chris, just from keeping an eye on the clock here, I kind of want to go to the staffing section now, but we should check to see if there's any typed in questions on the material and discussion so far, Peter?
No, I don't see any, but I'll just remind, some people came in late. We have the question and answer section in the, if you click on the three shapes, the triangle, square, circle, we do have a Q&A section in there if you guys want to ask. I know there was a comment made in the comment section, that's fine too, but if you want to tee up any questions for the panelists or the presenters, just put them in the Q&A section.
I think staffing and skills is the area that's been the most disruptive for the IT function and IT leaders themselves. So from key issues, we've got data here that shows the number of CIOs who said that their staff is primarily working from home, that is at least 80% of the time they're at home, versus hybrid, which we're defining as between 20% and 80% of the time you're at home, but it's more of a 50-50 typically, office versus home. So we asked about those two types of working staffing models from before COVID. All right, so you see only 6% of IT on average working from home, 13% in a hybrid. That's 19% people not always working in the office. That seems low to me based on discussions with organizations, but that's how it came up. During the peak of the crisis, it's basically 100% of people are either working from home or hybrid. 66% stayed home through the peak of the crisis. Currently, it's not much different, unfortunately, 95%. Scaling back a little bit in terms of working from home, but not that much. And then the big question, what's going to be like after? And what you see here is about a third of each CIO that we a third of the CIOs we surveyed said they're either going to have hybrid or working from home or a combination, and that's 2/3%. So for you, it may be different. Nobody's going to match this exactly, but I got to ask our CIOs about this because this opens up a lot of challenges, leading people who are remote, inspiring people who are remote, innovating. Can you innovate from home, with your team? Are the managers in the IT function up to this task? Can they make sure that they have enough face time? Are the users, are the stakeholders going to forget about IT when they're out of sight? Are they out of mind? And finally, another challenge is are people productive? I mean, that's a bigger issue than IT staff, but how do we know, productivity isn't taking a hit here? So there's a lot of questions rolled into that, and you can comment on any of that. Brian, why don't we check in with you on your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, for our organization, I think those numbers are about right. And I think all those questions you brought up are like very legit questions. I think it's going to place a premium in some cases on professional development. You know, I mean, let's face it, I think IT historically and probably presently has always struggled a little bit with the Peter principle. You know, we've got some of our best people who might be, you know, great tech leaders, but may not always be maybe the best managerial leaders. I think, you know, having their staff now kind of to not in one location, I think, or at least not on a regular basis, I think is going to is a real issue that we're going to have to come to grips with. That people are going to need help. They're going to need training to kind of improve those skills a little bit. I think the good news is on the productivity side, we've now had 6+ months to kind of assess COVID, and I think Greg said this earlier, and I think, you know, like the results are in on some level, and I think by and large IT seems to be doing exceedingly well, you know, in terms of being able to remain productive. I mean, I think in our field, you know, it's a little bit different in operational side than the development side versus the development side, but operationally, some of those things, you know, the good thing is with cloud is, again, many things can be done remotely. You know, you're not racking and stacking as much as the old days. You still have telecom and other challenges that don't lend themselves to that, but by and large, I think the facts are in, and I think they're very positive, which is extremely encouraging. I think, you know, I mean, there's a lot here. I think, you know, it puts a big premium on sort of. I do think innovation's suffering, and I'll say this on a personal note. I hope that we're going to look back on this time and say 2-3 years from now, we're going to look at a current Zoom or even a current Google Meet thing, and we're going to be like, wow, I can't believe we did all that with that tool. Because I think there's so much room for improvement as you kind of evolve from being able to have a video conversation with people to sort of like, how do we innovate? And we whiteboard a lot of things, and our world's very complicated. You know, trying to service almost 40,000 people on almost a nightly basis. There's a lot of tech that goes on behind the scenes, and trying to do this over a video screen with some early stage whiteboarding tools isn't really getting us there. So it's a real challenge on that level, but I'll leave it to Greg to kind of maybe, you know, provide his sort of insight.
Oh, I long for my whiteboard. I miss it so much. Yeah, unfortunately, my wife won't let me have one wall of our office in here whiteboarded, so I can draw all over the wall. It's just not permitted. But I think this chart is accurate. I do think that, you know, from a motivation standpoint, Rick kind of touched on how do you keep staff motivated. I think it goes to, you know, leaders have got to lead, and I lead for results. That's what I look for. How we get there has changed a bit, but we have to be aggressive in our performance plans. We have to have a lot more interaction because we're in a virtual environment than we would normally in the physical office, and we have to be vigilant about making sure that we're delivering against the goals and the objectives and hitting our results. But I think that it does start with the performance plans. I know Brian talked about professional development. I think that's key to kind of ramp those functions up from an HR perspective in a COVID environment where we're working remotely. But we got to go back to the basics and make sure that our performance plans, just because we're working virtually, are not softballs. They have to be aggressive. They have to have meaningful, achievable results, and we got to go for it. I always develop plans that are more aggressive than we can achieve every single year, because you know, the bar from my perspective has to be higher than potentially we can hit. That's how we keep performing and growing and learning how to do things better and faster and cheaper. So I do think the two things of aggressive performance plans, more frequent interaction, and you know, training for staff on you know, from what Brian's perspective was, I think that's spot on.
What about this idea of visibility to your stakeholders? Are either of you worried about that?
Well, good, Craig. Sorry.
I'm not as much worried about it now because we do have a lot of interaction with not only the IT teams, but with the rest of our organizations. We're still driving our project portfolio discussions and team meetings and core team discussions and vendor discussions. We've got the whole mesh of people involved in this. So we're still very much interacting. It's just in a virtual environment. We're just interacting differently. You know, instead of being in a conference room where we're whiteboarding something and then, you know, having, you know, flip charts to do some diagrams on workflows, we're having to use different tools to get there, but we're still front and center. And, you know, our organization and our board, CEO all the way up, recognizes that we're in the place that we are and we're still achieving the goals and objectives in the organization because IT is still in the forefront and because we're still driving those initiatives. We have to be seen We have to be perceived as adding value, because I believe perception is fact to the individual, whether it's your customer, whether it's your staff that you're serving. And if you're not serving them appropriately, they're going to recognize you as not leading by example and getting the stuff done that you need to get done.
Hey, Rick, I want to interrupt. There was two questions I want to, and
Sure.
one that's we're still on that topic about the challenge of the overheard conversations, and I'm putting air quotes because the water cooler stuff, all that stuff. Robert asked the question about that. How are other people seeing that? And I'll put that out to the panelists, Gregory and Brian. Are you guys dealing with that in any kind of special way? The overheard conversation problem? Do you guys have a way to sort of handle that?
Well, one thing that we haven't said thus far, which I think is important, is the, especially in sort of a world where not everyone is, we now all are officially kind of in sort of this remote workforce model, whether we like it or not. And I do think communications needs to take on a higher priority. I don't think it's specifically been called out yet, but we've doubled down a little bit on sort of our corporate portals and other sort of tools to kind of try to, create like a single gathering point for the organization where we can. And I think, IT in general has scored like high marks here, because I think, whether it's COVID information or other sort of things, how to, training videos, like we're putting out more of that than ever before. And I think, as Greg had said, in order to remain relevant, you need to kind of remain, visible to some extent. And I think one way, a really good way of doing that, if your company is kind of well positioned for this, is to leverage your corporate, portal or intranet or whatever the right tool is in your respective business, to make sure you get the message on a regular basis. Like, what are you doing in cybersecurity? What do we ask employees to do? How do we have greater endpoint protection? How do we educate them on sort of the changing role of the nature of IT as we're working with them on projects and things? And so I think that's one that's really important. And it's never a replacement for the social element. Yeah. I mean, we've tried to do some things with, we do a lot of light things too, from cooking things to people. We put Zumba things out there on our corporate portal these days and stuff. And so we've kicked it around. I don't know. I'm not the right person to score it, but if I were scoring it, it wouldn't be a very super high number.
Fair enough. Hey, Rick, just a time check. We're coming up at the top of the hour. Just make sure you get to your, the wrapping up here. So.
Yes, sir. We've got a couple of other things to share. Chris, why don't you speak to this the shifts in operating models that we're seeing?
Yeah, and just very quickly, we've done, in addition to key issues, we did a couple uncertainty polls and how IT leaders are thinking about it organizationally or from an operating model perspective. And so over the past 6 months, we've seen a range between 40 to 60% of IT leaders are changing their models. And we gave, within the key issues study, the option to pick, which relevant models you are considering. And so these don't add up to 100 because you click multiple. And honestly, in my experience, I haven't seen any organization yet go whole hog, go fully into any one particular type of model. Most of them are using a hybrid, but the prevalent one that seems to be resonating is a product or platform-based model, where essentially we have either enabling platforms such as ERP or HCM, HRIS systems, and they have their own dedicated budgets, their own dedicated teams, their own dedicated developers for that. And so organizing around the different products or platforms that either our internal customers are using or even those for our external customers. And then a lot of the strategy and governance and those types of things are more in a centralized IT or a shared services type of model. So seems to be the predominant model in terms of how to fund and how to move more rapidly in terms of development, et cetera, to production. The broker orchestrate integrate resonates here with an aggressive move towards cloud. We're not building this stuff ourselves, but rather brokering introductions to third parties and integrating that into our model. So
I think the goal seems to be to move toward owning less assets in IT, and that creates more agility and perhaps savings as well. So our last summation here, I just want to, Chris will walk you through it, but I want to tee it off for you. Basically, what must IT absolutely accomplish in 2021 for us to look back and say it was a success? It was a successful year because IT got this, and this done. I want both panelists to give their answers for their organizations. But Chris, this is kind of Hackett's overall view of what has to happen in 2021.
Yeah, and we had numbers on here, we had bullets, we had letters. Couldn't figure out the right way to show it because they're all a priority. That's the hard part, right? These are all things that we should use as a checklist almost, and say, have we gone down this path yet? What really for our overall recovery, and we've heard a lot about recovery curves, but what's going to be absolutely necessary and maybe a strategic or competitive advantage that we need to think about from a technology perspective. Certainly on our side, I've drank the Kool-Aid. I'm a strong believer in relationships with the business, and so I think the elevating the role and the skills of the business partners, the BRMs, is core. That's going to help reduce or how we look at demand, which we've talked about here. That's going to help drive what technologies or platforms we want to accelerate or put into place. It's all about having an understanding of what the business needs for them to be successful. I think having an overall model, sustainable model of innovation is going to be core, and that's going to extend itself to both our overall operating model that we just hit on, and also talking about the enterprise data model that both our panelists here have noted as being of high importance. We need to think about data in terms of how we're establishing our technology footprints and almost the fabric of interconnectedness between all of the disparate sources of information to turn that into valuable decision making. So try to be quick on that, but Gregory and Brian, if you have any comments on things that that resonate for you.
I think it's a pretty accurate list, quite frankly, and I think that depending upon the organization and the preparedness for COVID, they're going to be at different stages of prioritization from this list.
Right.
Some might have their priority to return to business stability as a higher goal because they're just not there yet from a revenue standpoint, from a product standpoint, from a supply chain standpoint, and other teams are going to be a little bit farther ahead and might be focusing on other things like elevating the role and upgrading the skills of IT business partners, the BRM side. But I think it's a pretty good list for what's going to be coming down the pike in 2021 for IT organizations and how they're going to have to adapt probably half the year virtually and half the year physically in order to accomplish the goals of the organization. Because I do see it as probably a split fiscal year if you're running calendar to calendar. I do see that we're probably not going to be in the back to normal phase until we get probably to Q2 or Q3 of 2021. So this is going to be an interesting year where we've got a lot of things to work on, but some virtually and some, hybrid or back to the normal office environment.
And what's your number one accomplishment for next year, Gregory?
Probably focus on ERP and business intelligence.
And Brian, what's your what do you absolutely have to get done next year?
Sort of a new, kind of a more digitally focused effort toward fans. Fans coming back, creating sort of a safe environment where they can sort of enjoy the game, transact business, and and really and do that in a very sort of as touchless as we can.
Hands off fan experience is what you've got to accomplish.
Absolutely.
Gosh. Okay. Well, I'll be going to the park if they allow it. So I'll call you afterward and tell you how many touch points I avoided.
Sounds good.
Peter, do you want to?
I just want to thank everybody for kicking us off as usual. Rick, we love the Hackett Group content. We love the fact that thank you to our panelists Gregory and Brian and Christopher for obviously chiming in on all these important trends and the key issues coming up in 2021. So thanks again to all the folks this morning on the panel on the kickoff, the keynote. And I just want to remind everybody that we are going into 2 weeks. So Monday through Thursday we have sessions every single day from noon until about 3 o'clock, and then some of the days go longer. You can check out the whole agenda at midmarket.com. And we have we're going to be going right into a workshop right now into the work from home in 2021. So I think we'll see you on the other side if you guys are going to join us, and we look forward to seeing you there. All right.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, everybody.
Everybody, appreciate it. Talk soon.
Cheers. All right.